The Intellivision. Besides having a name that I constantly misspelled in this script, it's an awesome console. I wouldn't necessarily call it underrated, since it has a legion of diehard fans, but it's definitely not talked about as much as its competition, the Atari VCS, and the ColecoVision. Let's find out why. It's 1977 and the second generation of gaming is just starting. Although it's called the second generation of gaming, the consoles released in this period were the first with any sort of mainstream success. Well, mainstream might be a stretch for the likes of the Magnavox Odyssey 2 or the Fairchild Channel F, but the success of the recently released Atari VCS cannot be understated. It was already on its way to becoming one of the most successful and iconic video game consoles of all time. This success would convince many other companies to give this whole video game thing a chance. Enter Mattel. They had released the first solid-state handheld electronic game, Auto Race, in 1976, and were just about to release their iconic Mattel Football in June of 1977, which would be the first major sales success in the handheld video game market. It was at that point that Mattel decided to begin research and development for a system to compete with the Atari. Although development would be slow with many hurdles, the Intellivision would eventually be born from this project. The biggest issue Mattel had to deal with was chip production. Mattel was a toy company and didn't have the resources to produce their own chips. This meant they would have to partner with an outside company. Mattel had two promising companies to choose between. The first was a new chip designed by National Semiconductor. This new chip would have been very powerful, but also quite expensive. Mattel negotiated a new reduced price, and National Semiconductor agreed to simplify the chip somewhat to reduce cost. But even then, margins would be thin for both companies. The other option, which was recommended by a consulting firm, was a new chip from General Instruments, the Gemini, not to be confused with the Coleco Gemini, which we just did a video on. Very similar names. The big issue with this chip is that it lacked programmable graphics, which is kind of important for a video game console. General Instruments began working on a revised chip. Mattel initially selected the chip from National Semiconductor in August of 1977, but 2 months later changed their mind and officially selected the GI chip. Now that chip selection was finalized, Mattel worked at building out from the GI chip to build a full video game console. That system, the Intellivision, was revealed to the public at the 1979 Computer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, to much attention. It was shown off as a system of two separate pieces, the Intellivision master component for playing video games, and the keyboard component, which featured additional hardware to extend the Intellivision into a full computer, a concept that was very popular at the time. Each component would sell for a price of $165. That's just under $600 each in today's money. In June, Mattel would revise the price to $250 for each component, a pretty sizable increase. Even with that price increase, the Intellivision was a pretty big success in its limited 1979 release. It was only available in select retailers in Fresno, California, or as a mail-order system from JCPenney, but sold very well in the holiday season. The keyboard component was not on sale, but Mattel promised it would be released soon. By the summer of 1980, the Intellivision was available nationwide with a pack-in game, Las Vegas Poker and Blackjack. The library of games was still really small at the time, with only 10 available games. They would ultimately sell just under 200,000 units in 1980, and more games would be created by both Mattel itself and third parties like Activision and iMagic, whose games were often even better than the first-party ones. Mattel's marketing strategy was simple but brilliant, since the Intellivision was in fact more capable than the Atari VCS. Many advertisements featured direct comparisons of an Atari game next to a similar Intellivision title. Mattel also pushed the Intellivision as the more sophisticated system for more sophisticated people, with longer, more complex games than the single-button games that Atari could offer, with a big focus placed on sports titles. To put it simply, Mattel wanted to make you feel dumb for choosing Atari. The market was moving at a rapid pace, and the Intellivision would quickly become outdated compared to newer consoles and the rise of home computers. And speaking of computers, that keyboard component that Mattel had pushed so heavily at the system's launch, then delayed over and over, yeah, it never came out. Which is a shame because the planned specs for it were very impressive. It would have added a 6502 processor to the Intellivision and an additional 16K of RAM, which would have made it one of the most powerful consoles on the market for years, while offering some computer functions. The large number of consumer complaints charging false advertising from the lack of the keyboard component triggered an investigation by the Federal Trade Commission. Mattel was issued a fine of $10,000 per day that the keyboard was not delivered. To get around this quite expensive fee, Mattel canceled the keyboard component and replaced it with the Entertainment Computer System, a severely neutered version adding only 2K of RAM and an extremely limited basic programmer. Still, a very small number of the original keyboards did make it to market. 4,000 were produced, but it's estimated only 500 made it to store shelves, with the rest being used by Mattel employees or being scrapped for parts. This makes the keyboard component a very rare collector's item today. Now let's talk about the game library. Like I said earlier, the Intellivision had a serious lack of games at first. That would change over time, but it does have quite the small library overall, with only 150 titles. The ColecoVision, which came out 2 years later and had half as long of a lifespan, had about the same number of titles. The Atari, on the other hand, had over 500 games. One way to get around the rather small library was to buy a system changer, which was sold by Mattel at the end of the Intellivision's life, which was an accessory that allowed the system to play Atari games. Unfortunately, it isn't compatible with the original model Intellivision without modding, even though the library is pretty small and mostly sports games. There are some real gems mixed in there, including some games that leverage the increased power of the Intellivision to create new concepts for games that would later prove very successful. The two biggest examples of this would be Utopia, the first God Sim game reminiscent of later games like Sim City or Black and White, and Sea Battle, which may have been the first real-time strategy game ever made. Another innovative game was Body Surgeon. It's a weird one, combining an arcade space shooter with the closest thing to a realistic medical simulator the system could handle. The controller for the Intellivision is pretty interesting. Rather than using a joystick, it uses a flat, circular disc. It also was one of the first systems to use a full numerical keypad with overlays, something competitors would copy for the next several years. Overall, it's not my favorite controller ever, but I have to admit I do like it better than either the ColecoVision controller or the controller of the Atari 5200. One thing I really appreciate about the Intellivision is the packaging for games. You see, there was a lot of stuff to keep track of with your new games. There was the cartridge itself, and you definitely would need the manual since these games tend to be a bit less intuitive than the single-button affairs of Atari, plus the controller overlays that most games came with. Because of that, game boxes were actually meant to be kept, rather than the, oh, that's a cool box, and then chucking it in the trash. Boxes used a clamshell-style cardboard box, with the cartridge going on the right side in a plastic holder, with the left side housing the manual and controller overlays. Later, boxes would remove the plastic holder to reduce costs. Overall, the Intellivision was a moderate success. It sold fairly well up until the video game crash of 1983. We talked before in our ColecoVision episode about how Coleco wasn't impacted that severely by the crash. Even Atari would survive the crash, though with some corporate shakeups. The same isn't true for the Intellivision. Before the crash, Mattel Electronics was one of the most profitable branches of the company. By the end of 1983, they were losing millions of dollars. On August 4th, 1983, Mattel announced that they would be laying off 660 employees from the electronics division and stop all hardware development, becoming a third-party publisher making games for their old competition and the IBM PC. That didn't last. In January of 1984, the last of the programming staff were laid off and the division was officially closed. Mattel would then sell the rights for the Intellivision to the now former Mattel Electronics Senior Vice President of Marketing, Terrence Valesky, who would form the new INTV Corporation to continue selling Intellivisions and games in a very lean, under-the-radar strategy that was successful enough to keep the Intellivision, well, not in the spotlight, but in existence into the early 1990s. This video was focused on the story of the original iconic Intellivision, but there are a lot of other interesting facets with the Intellivision platforms we would like to cover in the future. There's the Intellivision 2, a redesign of the Intellivision Mattel released to decrease costs. There's also the two rebranded consoles. Much like Atari did, Mattel licensed out the Intellivision to two retail stores to sell under their own brands. First was the Super Video Arcade, sold by Sears under their Telegames brand. And then there was the rather rare Tandyvision 1, sold by Radio Shack. Both of these consoles are Intellivisions, but they use very different designs for the physical case from the original model. There's also the INTV System 3 and Super Pro System, two revised models of the Intellivision sold by INTV. Also, there's the absolutely crazy planned but cancelled Intellivision 3 and 4, which had specs that were frankly impossible for the time. It's crazy how forward-thinking they were, and it's no surprise that they never materialized. Or there are the more recent dealings as the brand has been passed from owner to owner, like the various flashback consoles and the Intellivision Amico. That's a lot, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss those videos. And now it's time for the ratings. Rarity, 1 out of 5. The Intellivision sold 3 million units. That's a pretty high number, not even counting clones or modern re-releases. You should have no trouble adding one to your collection. Price, 4 out of 5. While the original Intellivision console is getting more expensive as time goes on, it's still fairly cheap. Even better, games for the Intellivision are very, very cheap. You should have no problem filling out a shelf of boxed games. Aesthetics, 5 out of 5. Some people may not like the look of the Intellivision, but I think it looks fantastic. Wood grain with gold trimming? Sign me up. Games, 3 out of 5. Yeah, the Intellivision library is relatively small, and many of the games don't hold up that well, but there are some real gems out there. Most of the sports games are actually pretty good once you learn how to play them, and as I mentioned earlier, there are many great titles that went under the radar. It's a shame that the homebrew scene for the Intellivision isn't nearly as active as it is for the other second-generation consoles. Convenience, 1 out of 5. Old consoles can be tricky to get working well in the modern era. Only having an RF output sucks, and if one of your controllers dies, you are out of luck since they can't be swapped without modding the system, at least on this original model. So that's the Intellivision. Not exactly a massive success, but it was still a very innovative console for its time. What do you think? Are you a big Intellivision fan? Have you never played an Intellivision? Let us know in the comments down below. Make sure to like this video, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications. Check out our Patreon, where you can support us financially, and you can discuss anything retro video game related on our Discord server. And I'll see you next time.